مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. يتابع الناس في أنحاء العالم انتخاباتنا الرئاسية في نوفمبر، وهم متشوقون لمعرفة من سيقود أميركا في السنوات الأربع القادمة، وما إذا كانت أميركا ستقود العالم برسالة السيادة الوطنية أم بقوة الشراكات والتحالفات، وما إذا كنا سنساند الحروب بطريقة عادلة في أوكرانيا وغزة. أجوبة هذه الأسئلة سيكون لها تأثيرات هائلة على الحرب والسلم في العالم لسنوات عديدة قادمة. لكل هذه القضايا الأهمية نفسها، لكن عدد أقل من الناس سيركزون على من سيسيطر على الكونغرس بمجلسيه الشيوخ والنواب. في النظام الأمريكي لا تتم الموافقة على أي قانون، ولا يتم إنفاق دولار واحد، ولا يتم التصديق على أي معاهدة، ولا يتم تعيين سفير دون موافقة أحد مجلسي الكونغرس أو كليهما. والمنافسة مشتدة بين الجمهوريين والديمقراطيين للسيطرة على المجلسين. لبحث السباق للسيطرة على السلطة التشريعية للحكومة الأميركية، يسعدني أن أرحب بنخبة من المراقبين السياسيين البارزين أليكس بولتون ونايومي ليم وأنجيلا غرايلينغ كين. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. In the countdown to our November presidential election, it's important to keep at least one eye on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, the race to control Congress. Let's take a closer look with Alexander Bolton, Angela Greiling Keene, and Naomi Lim. All right, let's start with the upper house of our legislature, the Senate. Alex, it's currently 51-49, but that doesn't really tell the story of what this Senate race is all about. Tell us more.
Well, the bottom line is that Republicans are favored to win back the Senate majority. A big factor there is Senator Joe Manchin, the conservative Democrat from West Virginia. He's retiring in a state that President Trump won by huge margins in 2016 and 2020. Republicans are already counting West Virginia as a pickup. So that puts essentially the Senate at a 50-50 going into November. And then the other seats the Democrats have to defend are seats that either Trump won by big margins in 2016 or 2020, or states, battleground states that where Biden is trailing Trump. And so the two next most likely Republican pickups after West Virginia are Montana, which Trump won handily in 2016-2020. There, the incumbent, John Tester, is running neck and neck with the Republican challenger. And then in Ohio, Sherrod Brown, longtime incumbent, he's the Democrat. He's running against another Republican incumbent. Those are the two most likely Democrats to lose. And then the next tier of competitive races are Nevada, Michigan, Arizona, and maybe Pennsylvania as well. So Republicans are looking to pick up, I would say, 2 to 4 seats at this point in the Senate.
I mean, it's an interesting way that this year plays out, Angela. Of the 33 seats being contested, 23 of them are Democratic seats. So it's a huge imbalance just to begin with. If you're running the Democratic campaign for the Senate, how do you deal with this?
Indeed, there are 23 seats up this year, and 34 seats, with 23 being defended by Democrats. So Republicans are only incumbents in 11 of the seats. So it really is terrible timing for Democrats to be trying to retain control of the Senate. As Alexander said, the map is not in their favor, nor are the candidates that they have in places that they are hoping to defend. What Democrats are trying to do, a big part of their messaging, messaging is to make places competitive that don't look like they should be on the map. One of those is Florida, where incumbent Rick Scott is running against Congresswoman Debbie Murkessel-Powell, and Democrats are trying really hard to raise the profile of that race, to raise money. Senator Scott has recently announced his candidacy to be Republican leader in the Senate, with Mitch McConnell stepping down from that post. So Democrats are certainly hoping that that will be a distraction, and they are talking a lot about that race. Democrats are also hoping to make Texas competitive. They have solid candidates there with Colin Allred, but the chances of flipping either Florida or Texas in the Democrats' favor are low, given recent trends in both of those states. Texas has been a red state for a long time. Florida has been traditionally thought of in recent decades as a swing state. However, Florida has not voted for a Democratic senator or governor in quite a long time. The last Democrat to win statewide in that state was the agriculture commissioner.
And so, Naomi, if you're a Democrat, what is your strategy, to run close to Joe Biden or to run away from Joe Biden? Do local state issues determine Senate races, or does the mood of the nation tend to determine a Senate race?
I think over the past election cycles, we've seen this trend towards the nationalization of these races, particularly the statewide races that we're seeing in the Senate. You know, for example, issues like abortion were very sort of instrumental, particularly since the Supreme Court overturned the abortion precedent Roe versus Wade, and we're seeing that again. That obviously is an issue that works in Democrats' favor, something that we're seeing Republicans leverage against Democrats in terms of the national stage is issues like immigration, although we're sort of seeing at least initial figures from an expected sort of surge in migrants coming across the border during springtime. We're not seeing that eventuate. So whether that's something that rears its head later in the season is something that we'll keep an eye on. I think that we're seeing Democrats, at least for the time being, sort of keep Joe Biden at arm's distance. And I think that's sort of because there are things like also the economy that has become very tied to him. You know, the White House has embraced this term, or used to embrace this term, Bidenomics, and we're sort of seeing that play out. But I think we'll see, depending on whether the idea of Donald Trump and this contrast that the Biden campaign is trying to create at a national level, if that becomes more effective, we're not seeing sort of polling bear that out, but if that becomes more effective, then maybe we'll see a warmer embrace closer to November.
Well, it's interesting. So, Alex, I asked whether Joe Biden is somebody that Democrats are running with or against. Are Republicans at statewide levels viewing Trump as a drag or as an asset? Angela pointed to two races, Florida and Texas, that Democrats hope to flip. Is there any possibility that there or someplace else Democrats do score a surprising win?
I think it's unlikely. While entering the cycle, Ted Cruz in Texas and Rick Scott in Florida were viewed as vulnerable. Polls right now show that their Democratic challengers are down substantially in both those races, and the Democrats are not top tier candidates. They're kind of second or even third tier level candidates, and the Democrats, because they have so many incumbents to defend, aren't going to put in the resources they would need to win in Republican-leaning and very large and very expensive states, Texas and Florida. Now, will Trump be a drag on Republican candidates running for the Senate? Probably not, and that's because right now early polling shows that Trump is outperforming Biden in a number of battleground states, and he's even outperforming the Republican candidates in those states. So the dynamic right now is that Trump is running ahead of Republican candidates in battlegrounds like Arizona, Nevada, Michigan, Pennsylvania, for example. And then in as I mentioned, Republicans already have a 50-50 Senate because Joe Manchin is retiring in deep red West Virginia, and the governor who's running as a Republican Jim Justice has very high approval ratings, so he's almost guaranteed to win that race. And then if you look at the two most likely Republican pickups in Montana and Ohio, those are both solidly Republican states. Yes, there are very strong they're very strong Democratic incumbents, Sherrod Brown and John Tester, but Donald Trump probably helps Republican candidates in those states because he's going to drive a very high voter turnout, Republican turnout. So he is seen as a plus for GOP candidates by and large.
And Angela, to what extent is a state-by-state Senate race? How much does the grudge match between two national leaders, Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer, have an impact? Do they play a role in Senate races around the country? As you said, this is Mitch McConnell's a farewell election, as it were. He's announced his imminent retirement from being head of the Republican Senate caucus, at least. Does this play at all in Senate races around the country?
I'm going to say no, not too much on that front. Obviously, each of the Senate's party leaders has a lot at stake. For McConnell, it's his basically full legacy. And for Schumer, he would like to keep control of the Senate and his position as majority leader. However, I don't think that level of politics is something that voters are going to be looking at as much as they are at the top of the ticket. That matters very much. There's increasingly less party splitting between the top of the ticket. So the vote for president and choices lower down the ballot, where we're unlikely to see people choosing Donald Trump and then a Democratic Senate candidate, or Joe Biden and a Republican Senate candidate. But in terms of the back and forth between the partisanship in the Senate, I don't see that playing a major role as voters decide who to choose for their Senate votes across the country.
And Naomi, are we seeing enough money, or as much money as we would expect in a national Senate race that is essentially 50-50, that will determine who will get to bring Supreme Court nominees to the floor, that sort of thing? I mean, this is a huge decision. Who's going to be the controlling party in the United States Senate?
I think one of the trends that we're seeing is Republican donors that were potentially spooked that the dollars that they were pouring into, for example, the Republican National Committee or the Donald Trump campaign, being siphoned off to defend Trump against his many legal battles. And so we're seeing this sort of double downing into investments in down ballot, whether it's the state or whether it's sort of House races that are also vulnerable to Republicans. And I think we're seeing that sort of eventuate. And I think that we'll see that happen more, particularly as the primaries become settled in terms of who the candidates will be.
All right. So before we go to the House, very quickly, I want to get your prognostication. Who ends up winning the United States Senate come November? Angela, let's start with you. Republicans or Democrats?
Republicans.
Republicans. Alex?
Republicans, and I think they're probably going to pick up, as I said, 2 to 4 seats. And it looks like if the election were held today, they would pick up seats in West Virginia, Ohio, and Montana. So that would give them a 52-seat majority. All
right, 2 for Republicans. And Naomi, what do you think?
I'll be different, and I'll say Democrats, but with potentially the help of a Democratic vice president.
All right, so you think it may end up 50-50 at the end of this election. Very interesting. All right, when we come back after the break, Angela, I'm going to start with you. We're going to go to the other side of Congress and talk about the race to control the House of Representatives in just a moment. Our guests again today include Alexander Bolton. Alex is a senior staff writer at The Hill, a newspaper offering in-depth reporting on the politics and policy in our national legislature, where he covers Congress and the broader American political scene. Also with us is Naomi Lim. Naomi is White House reporter at the Washington Examiner. She previously reported on crime and politics for News Corp in her native Australia. And with us today is Angela Greiling-Keane. She's the news director at Bloomberg Government and the Journalism and Women's Symposium president. Previously, she reported for Politico and was a past president of the National Press Club. Very impressive. Thank you for being with us. So, Angela, let's start with you. On the U.S. House of Representatives, the race is totally up in the air. All 435 seats being contested. What's at stake and what does it look like?
What's at stake is Republicans want to keep control of that chamber. We just talked about the Senate. They would like to control both chambers, of course, and the White House. So Republicans are right now, today, in a 217 majority to 213 Democrats. That's going to change to 218. So they'll have a 5-seat majority once the winner of the special election to fill the open Kevin McCarthy seat in California takes his seat. But right now, 4 or 5 seats, that's a very, very small majority. What Republicans want is to have a much more secure majority in that chamber. As we've seen over the past year and a half, it has been very, very difficult for Republicans to get their agenda passed, given divisions within their own party with such a small majority. We, of course, are on the second speaker in less than a year and a half because of Republican fractiousness. So what they are looking for is to expand that majority. Democrats, of course, are looking to take over that chamber. They see the Republican small majority as tantalizingly close, and they see a chance to pick up control of the House if they could retain control of the Senate, which, as we've discussed, is going to be a big challenge. Then they would have both chambers of Congress and see a chance to get more of their agenda advanced should they be able to take over the House. And they see an opportunity this year because of course, the entire map. They have a slightly more favorable look in their side because there are more districts that voted for Biden and have Republican members currently than there are districts that voted for Trump and have Democratic members presently.
Oh, very interesting. So, Naomi, one other aspect, we talked earlier about the imbalance in the Senate being so many Democratic seats up for grabs. In the House, there are already 19 retirements among Republicans. Did Democrats sense a moment of opportunity here?
I think that they do. I think this idea of Republicans, particularly retiring from the House, is sort of just a temperature gauge on what it's like to serve in that chamber. Sort of as Angela mentioned, the things that I'm sort of looking for in November are those 18 seats that are held by, that Biden won last cycle, but that held by Republicans now, particularly sort of in the New York, upstate New York area, and also in California. That's something that I'll be watching. The other thing that's sort of interesting too is whether the national tide will flip against Democrats, particularly where we're seeing sort of when polling with whether people would prefer to have a Democrat or a Republican, just a generic candidate. That polling is very even. So we'll just see how that plays out as well.
So, Alex, just to explain to our viewers, there are 435 seats up for election, but there aren't really competitive elections in 435 different districts. About how many of these are truly competitive elections?
Well, the battle for control of the House really comes down to 22 toss-up seats, and that's, according to the Cook Political Report, a longtime handicapper of House races. And they right now judge it as 11 Democratic seats are toss-ups and 11 Republican seats are toss-ups. So given how narrow the House Republican majority is, given that there are 22 toss-ups divided among or divided between Democratic and Republican seats, it certainly is a very close race. It's going to be very tough to call right up until Election Day. And I think what Angela and Naomi said is right. The folks are going to be looking at the New York and California as two areas where Democrats have an advantage and where there are a number of competitive seats, but they're scattered around the country right now. And a lot of it may depend on the national tide. If President Trump wins, if he beats Joe Biden in the past, the national tide has swept the House along with it. Of course, I think what's a little bit different this election cycle is Trump is probably going to lose the popular vote. And if he wins, he would win the electoral vote. So it's hard to imagine Trump winning the popular vote. So then you have to question whether a Trump victory is really going to bring the House along with him. So I would give the Democrats the advantage in taking back control of the lower chamber.
Very interesting. And Angela, I mean, do voters think about whether they prefer split government, namely the president of one party and Congress being controlled by another party? Do voters like that? Do they even think about it? Do they understand what the implications of that are?
In 2024, I think voters do not want that. We have clearly seen a partisan shift both to the left and to the right in this country over a number of decades. So we have seen less inclination for people to choose candidates based solely on issues. They are choosing based on party. What we are seeing is challenges within parties. So the primary season has been very interesting, and that is still ongoing. The primaries go for months and months because different states have different schedules for those elections to choose their own candidates before the general election in November. And we've certainly seen more moderate candidates be challenged from the left for Democrats and from the right for Republicans. So that shift is happening. But in terms of voters seeing an advantage to split party governance, no, I don't see that happening presently.
And just to follow up on that, Angela, when we see these primary battles, say within Democrats between moderates and progressives, who's generally winning? Is there a pattern we can see?
Well, the pattern, not new in voting in primaries, as well as voters that show up at caucuses and places where they choose their candidates earlier in an election cycle, is the people that take the time to vote or show up in those processes tend to be the voters that are more on the extremes of their parties. So we definitely are seeing more of the candidates further to the left and further to the right winning in contested primaries. There are some exceptions, of course, where moderates have put a lot of money, and parties have occasionally will put their fingers on the scale to choose a more moderate candidate. But generally, the party committees stay out of primaries and say that's up to the voters, and they'll put their money in the general election.
And Alex, can you point to one or two races?
Well, I mean, I'm a Senate guy, so I'm going to look at the Senate races.
And so just lastly, we asked for your prognostication about the Senate. Let me now ask about the House. Naomi, who wins the House in November?
I'm going to go with the Democrats.
So you got Democrats for both. Okay. Angela?
I'm going to go with Republicans. I think the overall trend is in their favor this year.
So you got Republicans holding on. And Alex, what do you say?
I think the Democrats are going to win back the House because I think they're fighting on their home turf in California and New York. I think the Republicans don't have a great record this Congress. There's been a lot of dysfunctionality in the House. This is one of the least productive Congresses in history, and I think it's going to hurt them come Election Day. So I think House and Senate both flip, and the White House is a toss-up.
All right. Well, fascinating. Different views on all these matters. That's terrific. So glad to have your insights into helping explain our congressional vote to our viewers abroad. Angela Greiling-Keane, Naomi Lim, Alexander Bolton, thank you for joining me this week on داخل واشنطن. وصلنا إلى ختام هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كانت لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات على هذا البرنامج وخاصة العلاقة بين كل من الانتخابات الرئاسية والتشريعية، أرجو التواصل معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو مراسلتي مباشرة @Rob Satloff. نلتقي في الأسبوع المقبل وحتى ذلك حين شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.